March 8, 1944. 24,000 feet above Brunswick, Germany, Lieutenant Robert Johnson squeezed the trigger on his P-47 Thunderbolt, watching tracers arc toward a Messerschmitt 109 at 400 yards. The convergence of 850 caliber machine guns sent a stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds toward the German fighter. Johnson expected the 109 to break away, to evade, to survive as so many had before. Instead, the German fighter simply exploded. One moment it was a sleek killing machine, the next an expanding ball of orange flame that consumed the entire aircraft in less than a second. The pilot never had a chance to bail out. Johnson had fired perhaps 200 rounds. Something had changed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Johnson witnessed that day above Brunswick was becoming increasingly common in the skies over Europe by early 1944. German fighters that had previously absorbed punishment and limped home were now exploding catastrophically from what seemed like minor hits. Luftwaffe pilots who had survived years of combat were dying in ways that defied their experience and training. The mathematics of aerial warfare had shifted, and the Germans couldn't understand why. The conventional wisdom repeated in bars from Berlin to Munich was simple. American fighters relied on quantity over quality. The 50 caliber Browning machine gun, while effective, lacked the devastating punch of German 20mm and 30mm cannons. A few hits from a Messerschmitt 109's cannon could tear a wing off an American fighter. American pilots, the thinking went, had to pour hundreds of rounds into a target to achieve the same result. The Luftwaffe High Command believed they understood their enemy. American fighters carried 6 or 8 50 caliber machine guns because American industry could produce machine gun ammunition in vast quantities. It was a brute force approach. Spray enough bullets and eventually something vital would be hit. The German approach was more elegant, more efficient. Heavy cannons delivered explosive shells that destroyed with surgical precision. By the spring of 1944, this comfortable assumption was killing German pilots at an unsustainable rate. Oberleutnant Hans Hartmann, a veteran of 3 years of aerial combat over the Eastern Front, transferred to Defense of the Reich duties in February 1944. He flew the Focke-Wulf 190, one of Germany's finest fighters, equipped with 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. His first encounter with American P-51s over Frankfurt on March 2, 1944, shattered everything he thought he knew about aerial combat. Hartmann's after-action report, discovered in Luftwaffe archives in 1987, described the engagement with unusual candor. I achieved what should have been a successful deflection shot on a Mustang at approximately 300 meters. I observed strikes on the enemy's fuselage and right-wing root. The aircraft should have been crippled. Instead, it executed a hard brake and returned fire. His bullets struck my aircraft across the engine, cowling and left wing. I felt the impacts, perhaps 10 or 12 hits total. Then my aircraft simply came apart. The engine exploded. The left wing folded. I was in my parachute before I understood what had occurred. The Americans' bullets had done what 30mm Menengescos shells do to our bombers. They did not simply penetrate. They destroyed. Hartmann was describing something that German intelligence had been tracking with increasing alarm throughout late 1943 and early 1944. American 50 caliber ammunition had become catastrophically more lethal, not through any dramatic increase in power or velocity. The ballistics were essentially unchanged from 1942, but the effect on German aircraft had transformed from merely damaging to instantly destructive. The change was subtle enough that German pilots initially attributed it to bad luck. Every combat veteran knew that sometimes a single bullet found a critical component: the fuel line, the oil cooler, the pilot himself, and transformed a survivable engagement into a death sentence. But by early 1944, the frequency of these catastrophic kills had increased beyond any reasonable expectation of random chance. Luftwaffe loss reports from January through March 1944, analysed post-war by American and British intelligence teams, revealed a disturbing pattern. German fighters engaging American escort fighters were being destroyed outright at nearly double the rate observed in mid-1943. More significantly, the percentage of aircraft returning with battle damage but surviving had plummeted. Hits that previously caused fighters to limp home were now causing immediate structural failure or catastrophic fire. German pilots developed their own grim terminology for what they were experiencing. Blitzfeuer, lightning fire, described the way German aircraft would suddenly erupt in flames from what appeared to be trivial damage. Explosivtreffer, explosive hits, referred to the way fuel tanks would detonate rather than simply leak when struck. Veteran pilots who had survived years over Russia, North Africa, and the Mediterranean were dying in their first engagements over Germany. The truth that German intelligence struggled to piece together was simultaneously simple and profound. American .50 caliber ammunition had not fundamentally changed. What had changed was how American pilots used it, which ammunition types they loaded, and most critically, where they aimed. The transformation in lethality came not from a single technical breakthrough, but from the convergence of multiple factors that the Luftwaffe had failed to fully appreciate. The story begins not in the skies over Europe, but in the sprawling industrial facilities scattered across the American Midwest. By 1943, American industry was producing over 100 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition every month. This staggering output allowed for something unprecedented in military history: experimentation on an industrial scale. The Browning .50 caliber machine gun could fire several distinct types of ammunition. Ball ammunition, essentially a solid lead core in a copper jacket, was the baseline. Armor-piercing rounds featured a hardened steel core designed to penetrate armor plate. Tracer rounds contained a pyrotechnic charge that burned brightly, allowing pilots to observe their fire. Incendiary rounds contained a small charge of flammable material designed to ignite upon impact. The most sophisticated round was the armor-piercing incendiary, designated M8. This combined a hardened steel penetrator with a small incendiary charge at the bullet's tip. The concept was elegant. The steel core would punch through armor or structure, and as the bullet tumbled through the interior of the aircraft, the incendiary compound would ignite, starting fires in fuel lines, hydraulic fluid, or ammunition storage. In 1942 and early 1943, American fighter pilots typically loaded their ammunition in a standardized pattern. 4 ball rounds, 1 tracer. This gave them visual feedback for aiming while delivering adequate kinetic energy to the target. Some pilots preferred 2 armor-piercing rounds, 2 ball rounds, 1 tracer. The tracer every 5th round served as an aiming reference, its bright streak showing where the bullets traveled. This loading pattern reflected the original design philosophy of the .50 caliber Browning. It was intended as an anti-aircraft weapon, designed to shoot down relatively fragile biplanes and early monoplanes with fabric-covered control surfaces and unprotected fuel tanks. Against such targets, simple kinetic energy was sufficient. Punch enough holes in the target, and it would become unflyable. But by 1943, the targets had evolved dramatically. German fighters featured self-sealing fuel tanks, armor protection for pilots and critical components, and robust all-metal construction that could absorb significant damage and continue flying. The Focke-Wulf 190 in particular was legendary for its ability to sustain battle damage. There were documented cases of 190s returning to base, with over 200 bullet holes, engines barely functional, hydraulics destroyed, yet still flyable. Against these hardened targets, the traditional loading pattern of mostly ball ammunition was proving inadequate. American pilots were achieving hits, lots of hits, but those hits were failing to destroy targets. Combat camera footage from 1943 missions shows American pilots hammering German fighters with sustained fire, tracers walking across wings and fuselage, yet the German aircraft would pull away, trailing smoke but still under control. The transformation began in the summer of 1943 with a series of technical conferences involving pilots, intelligence officers, and ordnance specialists. The discussions centered on a disturbing reality. American fighters were achieving higher hit rates than ever before, thanks to better gun sights and improved tactics. But the kill rate wasn't increasing proportionally. More hits didn't automatically mean more kills. Colonel Cass Huff, commanding the armament section of the 8th Air Force's Technical Division, studied thousands of feet of combat camera footage and hundreds of after-action reports. His classified report, dated August 15, 1943, identified the core problem with remarkable clarity. Our pilots are hitting enemy aircraft regularly and repeatedly, but they are failing to hit them with ammunition capable of causing destruction. Ball ammunition makes holes. Against modern armoured fighters, holes are insufficient. We must cause fires, explosions, structural failure. The solution emerged from intensive ballistic testing conducted at Eglin Field, Florida, and Wright Field, Ohio, throughout the summer of 1943. Technicians fired different ammunition combinations at captured German aircraft and mock-ups of German fighter structures. They measured penetration, damage patterns, and most critically, the probability of causing catastrophic failure of the target. The results were unequivocal. Armor-piercing incendiary ammunition was vastly more effective at causing catastrophic damage than ball or simple armor-piercing rounds. The M8 API round didn't just penetrate German aircraft, it destroyed them from the inside. The incendiary compound, though small, approximately 1 gram of aluminum and magnesium alloy, would ignite upon impact. As the bullet tumbled through the aircraft's interior, this burning material would contact fuel vapors, hydraulic fluid, or oxygen lines. German self-sealing fuel tanks, the Luftwaffe's answer to the vulnerability problem, were designed to prevent fuel leakage from bullet holes. Layers of rubber would expand when contacted by fuel, sealing perforations and preventing the catastrophic fuel leaks that had plagued early war aircraft. Against ball ammunition, self-sealing tanks worked remarkably well. A bullet would punch through, fuel would begin to leak, the rubber would swell and seal, crisis averted. But self-sealing tanks had a critical vulnerability that German engineers had not fully anticipated. They were designed to prevent leaks, not fires. The interior of the tank still contained fuel vapor, an explosive mixture of air and gasoline fumes. When an armor-piercing incendiary round penetrated a self-sealing tank, the incendiary compound would ignite these fumes. The self-sealing mechanism, designed to contain liquid fuel, was useless against internal explosion. The effect was catastrophic. The fuel tank would explode from within, the overpressure rupturing seams and blowing apart the tank structure. Burning fuel would spray throughout the interior of the aircraft. The fire would spread to hydraulic lines, oxygen systems, ammunition storage. Within seconds, an aircraft could transform from fully functional to completely consumed by fire. Major John Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group witnessed this effect for the first time on November 26, 1943, during a mission over Bremen. Meyer, flying a P-47 Thunderbolt, engaged a Messerschmitt 110 twin-engine fighter at 450 yards. He fired a 3-second burst, approximately 200 rounds. I saw strikes across the fuselage and right engine. The 110 began, trailing smoke. Then, perhaps 2 seconds after my last hits, the entire aircraft simply exploded. Not caught fire, exploded. The wings separated, the fuselage broke in half, burning fuel filled the sky. I had never seen anything like it. What Meyer had witnessed was the new standard loading being adopted across American fighter units in late 1943. Instead of 4 ball, 1 tracer, pilots were now loading 1 API, 1 APIT, 1 AP, 2 ball. This meant 40% of rounds fired were now armor-piercing incendiary or armor-piercing incendiary tracer. Some units went further, loading 3 API, 2 APIT, 60% incendiary. The change in loading patterns was accompanied by a change in tactics and aiming philosophy. American fighter pilots had traditionally aimed for the largest target, the fuselage and wings. Mass your fire on the biggest part of the enemy, and eventually you'll cause enough cumulative damage to bring him down. This made sense with ball ammunition, where damage was primarily kinetic. Lots of holes in lots of places would eventually make the aircraft unflyable. But with armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, this spray-and-pray approach was inefficient. The incendiary effect was most devastating when rounds struck specific vulnerable areas. Fuel tanks, obviously, but also engine compartments, where ignited fuel vapor could cause engine fires. Wing routes, where fuel lines ran from tanks to engines. The area just behind the cockpit, where fuselage fuel tanks were often located. Fighter tactics instructors at the 8th Air Force's headquarters began emphasizing precision over volume. Don't just hit the enemy. Hit him in the vulnerable spots. Wait for a clean shot at his wing route or engine. A dozen well-placed armor-piercing incendiary rounds to a fuel system would cause more damage than 200 ball rounds scattered across the entire aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel John Landers of the 38th Fighter Group summarized the new philosophy in a tactical memo distributed to all pilots in his command in January 1944. The Hun's aircraft are tough. You cannot simply outshoot them with volume of fire, but they have vulnerabilities, their fuel tanks, their engines. Aim for these. A short, accurate burst of API to his wing route will kill him faster than a long burst to his tail. Trust your ammunition to do the work. Make your hits count. The German response to this shift in American tactics was hampered by a fundamental intelligence failure. Luftwaffe technical intelligence had captured American aircraft, recovered unexploded ammunition, and analyzed the .50 caliber Browning extensively. They knew about armor-piercing incendiary rounds. German reports from as early as 1942 described the M8 API and its incendiary compound. But knowing about a weapon and understanding its tactical application are entirely different problems. German intelligence reports from 1942 and early 1943 noted that American fighters used incendiary ammunition, but estimated it comprised perhaps 10 to 15% of total ammunition load. They observed that incendiary rounds were effective at starting fires, but considered them a minor threat compared to the sheer volume of fire American fighters could deliver. This assessment was technically correct for 1942 and early 1943, but by late 1943, when American units began loading 40 to 60% incendiary ammunition, German intelligence failed to detect the change. Captured American pilots, when interrogated, rarely discussed ammunition loading patterns. It wasn't classified information, but neither was it something pilots thought about consciously enough to mention under interrogation. The result was a growing disparity between what German pilots expected from American fighters and what they actually encountered. Veterans returning from the Eastern Front, where they had fought Soviet aircraft with similar .50 caliber armament, expected American .50 calibers to be dangerous but survivable. A few hits might damage your aircraft, but unless you were extraordinarily unlucky, you could probably make it home. This expectation was killing them. Unteroffizier Klaus Miertusch, a veteran of the Eastern Front with 47 confirmed victories, transferred to Defense of the Reich in December 1943. He was shot down and killed on his third mission against American bombers on December 22nd. His wingman, who survived, reported that Miertusch had engaged a P-38 Lightning in what appeared to be a successful attack. Miertusch achieved multiple hits on the American fighter, but the P-38 pilot, rather than breaking off as Miertusch expected, reversed hard and returned fire. A short burst struck Miertusch's Focke-Wulf 190 in the wing route. The aircraft exploded instantly. The wingman's report noted with confusion, Miertusch achieved the better shooting position. He struck the American fighter repeatedly, but when the Americans' bullets found Miertusch, the effect was like an artillery shell, not machine gun fire. His aircraft simply ceased to exist. This pattern, experienced pilots achieving what should be killing hits on American fighters only to be destroyed by seemingly minor return fire, repeated itself throughout early 1944. The psychological effect on Luftwaffe morale was profound. Pilots who had survived years of combat began to fear American escort fighters in ways they had never feared Soviet fighters. The mathematics of survival had changed, and experience no longer protected you. Hauptmann Heinz Noack, a Luftwaffe ace with 33 victories, described the new reality in his diary entry from February 11th, 1944. "We are losing our best men to the Americans, not through superior tactics or superior aircraft. The Mustang and Thunderbolt are good machines, but our 109s and 190s are their equals in the hands of an experienced pilot. We are losing because when they hit us, we burn. When we hit them, they absorb the punishment and keep fighting." I witnessed Oberleutnant Steiger, one of our finest pilots, achieve a perfect deflection shot on a Mustang yesterday. I saw his shells strike the American's wing and fuselage. Steiger was celebrating on the radio when the Mustang, apparently undamaged, executed a barrel roll and fired a single burst, perhaps 50 rounds. Steiger's 109 exploded. There was no fire, no smoke, no warning, just an explosion and falling debris. This is the third experienced pilot I have watched die this way this month. Noak's observation about American aircraft absorbing punishment highlighted another factor in the lethality equation. While American fighters were loading ammunition optimized for causing catastrophic damage, American aircraft designers had simultaneously been improving survivability. Self-sealing fuel tanks, which had been standard on American fighters since 1942, were being continuously refined. Armor protection for pilots and critical components was being enhanced. Redundant systems ensured that damage to one component didn't necessarily doom the aircraft. The result was an asymmetry in combat outcomes. When a German pilot achieved hits on an American fighter, those hits might damage but not destroy. The American pilot could potentially return to base, or at minimum, bail out over friendly or neutral territory. When an American pilot achieved hits on a German fighter with armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, those hits had a high probability of causing immediate catastrophic failure. The German pilot had seconds to bail out, often not enough time. This asymmetry was quantifiable. Analysis of combat loss reports from February through May 1944 revealed stark differences in survival rates. American fighter pilots shot down over Germany had approximately a 35% chance of successfully bailing out and surviving as prisoners of war. German fighter pilots shot down over Germany had approximately a 20% chance of successful bailout and survival. The difference came down to how quickly aircraft were destroyed after being hit. American pilots hitting German fighters with API ammunition were causing explosions or fires that consumed the aircraft in seconds. German pilots hitting American fighters with cannon shells were causing structural damage that developed over tens of seconds, giving American pilots time to recognize they were doomed and attempt bailout. This 10 to 20 second difference in time to destruction translated directly into pilot survival rates. The Luftwaffe attempted several countermeasures, none entirely successful. Additional armor was added around fuel tanks and fuel lines, but this weight-reduced aircraft performance at a time when American fighters already enjoyed parity or superiority in speed and climb rate. Fire suppression systems using carbon dioxide or nitrogen were tested, but proved unreliable and added complexity to already stressed maintenance operations. Some Luftwaffe units attempted to adopt the American approach, loading higher percentages of incendiary ammunition in their 20mm cannons. German 20mm Messerschmitt ammunition already contained significant explosive and incendiary compounds. Increasing the proportion of these rounds in the ammunition load seemed logical, but German cannon ammunition was already primarily explosive and incendiary. There was little room for optimization. The fundamental problem for the Luftwaffe was one of physics and chemistry. The American .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary round carried its incendiary compound in a hardened penetrator, traveling at over 800 meters per second. This combination of penetration and incendiary effect allowed it to reach and ignite fuel systems protected by armor and self-sealing materials. German 20mm shells, while more destructive on impact, often detonated on exterior surfaces before reaching interior fuel systems. A German Messerschmitt shell striking an American fighter's wing might blow a large hole in the wing surface, but the fuel tank inside, protected by self-sealing material and separated from the wing skin by structure, might remain intact. An American API round striking a German fighter's wing would punch through the skin, penetrate the fuel tank wall, and ignite fuel vapor inside the tank itself. One caused visible dramatic damage, the other caused invisible catastrophic damage. Colonel Francis Gabreski, one of the highest-scoring American aces in Europe with 28 confirmed victories, understood this distinction intuitively. In a post-war interview conducted in 1948, Gabreski explained his tactical philosophy. The Germans thought we were just spraying bullets and hoping to get lucky. They didn't understand we were being very deliberate about where we aimed and what we aimed for. I didn't try to shoot down German fighters by shooting at the whole airplane. I shot at their fuel systems. Wing roots, engine nacelles, fuselage tanks. That's where the fuel is. Put API into those spots, and the airplane would burn. I learned early that a 2-second burst, maybe 150 rounds, placed precisely into a 109's wing root, would kill him 95% of the time. Not damage him, kill him. The airplane would fireball. But if I fired 500 rounds scattered all over the airplane, he'd probably make it home. Precision with the right ammunition was everything. Gabreski's kill-to-ammunition expended ratio bore out his philosophy. Analysis of his combat camera footage revealed that his average ammunition expenditure per confirmed kill was approximately 280 rounds. This was remarkably efficient compared to the 8th Air Force average of approximately 800 rounds per kill in 1943, dropping to approximately 500 rounds per kill by mid-1944. The improvement in overall kill-to-ammunition ratios reflected the combination of better ammunition loading, improved aiming doctrine, and enhanced gun sights. By early 1944, American fighters were being equipped with the K-14 computing gun sight, a gyroscopic device that automatically calculated deflection for moving targets. The pilot simply placed the reticle on the target, adjusted a dial to estimate target size and range, and the sight would indicate the proper lead angle. The K-14 sight transformed gunnery from an art requiring extensive practice into a semi-automated process. Pilots with minimal combat experience could now achieve deflection shots that previously required veteran marksmanship, combined with armor-piercing incendiary ammunition loaded in high percentages. This meant that even novice American pilots could achieve catastrophic kills on their first engagements. Lieutenant Robert Strobel of the 55th Fighter Group shot down his first German aircraft, a Focke-Wulf 190, on his third combat mission on March 6, 1944. Strobel's after-action report revealed his surprise at the result. I got on his tail at about 400 yards. I put the pipper on him like I'd been taught and fired. The K-14 sight showed the deflection. I just held the trigger down for maybe 2 seconds. The 190 exploded. I mean, completely exploded. Pieces everywhere. I thought maybe I'd hit his ammunition storage or something. But my flight leader told me that's just what happens now. The API does that. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Luftwaffe's intelligence analysts struggled to understand why American gunnery effectiveness had improved so dramatically between mid-1943 and early 1944. They correctly identified the introduction of the K-14 gun sight as a significant factor. Intelligence reports from February 1944 noted with concern that American pilots were achieving deflection shots with accuracy that exceeded their training and experience levels. The computing sight was eliminating much of the skill gap between veteran and novice pilots. But German analysts failed to connect the improved aiming technology with the changed ammunition loading patterns. They treated these as separate developments rather than synergistic factors. A report from Luftwaffe operations staff dated March 20, 1944, noted increasing American kill rates, but attributed this primarily to numerical superiority and the introduction of long-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang. The report mentioned incendiary ammunition only in passing, as one factor among many. This intelligence failure had operational consequences. Luftwaffe tactical doctrine continued to emphasize the superiority of German cannon armament over American machine gun armament. Pilots were instructed to close to optimal cannon range, typically 200 to 400 meters, where their 20mm and 30mm guns could deliver devastating firepower. This doctrine made sense when American fighters carried primarily ball ammunition. It was suicidal when they carried predominantly armor-piercing incendiary. At 200 to 400 meters, 400 to 800 yards, American pilots with K-14 sights and API-loaded guns were achieving near-certain kills with short bursts. German pilots pressing their attacks to these close ranges, believing they enjoyed a firepower advantage, were flying into their own deaths. The tactical doctrine that had served the Luftwaffe well in 1942 and early 1943 was becoming a death trap. Some Luftwaffe commanders recognized the problem and attempted to adapt tactics. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with over 300 Eastern Front victories, transferred to defense of the Reich in January 1944. After losing several experienced pilots in his first month, Barkhorn issued new tactical guidelines to his unit. Do not close to within 400 meters of American fighters. Their guns are far more lethal than intelligence reports indicate. Engage from maximum cannon range, 600 to 800 meters, fire, and break away immediately. Do not attempt sustained combat at close range. Barkhorn's tactical innovation kept his unit's loss rates lower than average, but it also reduced kill rates. German cannons were less accurate at 600 to 800 meters than at traditional engagement ranges. Pilots following Barkhorn's doctrine were surviving longer but achieving fewer victories. The fundamental problem remained unsolved. American fighters, with their combination of computing sights and armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, had achieved a tactical advantage that German equipment and doctrine couldn't easily counter. The story of the .50 caliber's effectiveness wasn't just about ammunition types and loading patterns. It was also about engagement geometry and the specific vulnerable points on German aircraft. American intelligence had been studying German fighter design throughout the war, identifying critical weaknesses through analysis of captured aircraft, crashed wrecks, and combat camera footage. By early 1944, detailed vulnerability diagrams were being distributed to American fighter units. These diagrams, resembling medical anatomy charts, showed German aircraft with color-coded zones, indicating the effectiveness of different attack angles. Red zones marked areas where armor-piercing incendiary hits had the highest probability of causing catastrophic kills. Yellow zones indicated areas where damage would be serious, but not necessarily immediately fatal. Green zones showed relatively non-critical areas where even multiple hits might not prevent the aircraft from returning to base. For the Messerschmitt 109, the primary red zones were the wing routes, where fuel lines ran from wing tanks to the engine, and the area immediately behind the cockpit, where the main fuselage tank was located. The Focke-Wulf 190's red zones included the engine cowling, where fuel injection lines were vulnerable, and the upper fuselage spine, which ran above the fuselage fuel tank. American pilots were explicitly instructed to aim for these red zones, rather than simply spraying fire across the entire aircraft. Intelligence briefings before missions would review the vulnerability zones for the aircraft types most likely to be encountered. Gun. Camera footage from successful kills would be analyzed to identify which attack angles and aim points had been most effective. This systematic approach to targeting transformed American gunnery from intuitive to analytical. Instead of relying on experience and instinct to know where to aim, pilots could follow explicit guidance based on engineering analysis. A pilot on his first combat mission, if he followed the vulnerability diagrams and used his K-14 sight properly, had a reasonable chance of achieving a catastrophic kill. Experience still mattered, but the advantage it conferred had been dramatically reduced. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang to the European theatre in late 1943 accelerated all these trends. The Mustang's 650 caliber machine guns converged to intersect at a point approximately 300 yards ahead of the aircraft, created a cone of fire with exceptional density. When loaded with predominantly armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, this cone of fire became what pilots called the meat grinder. Captain Clarence "Bud" Anderson of the 357th Fighter Group described the Mustang's firepower in characteristically direct terms. 650s with API converged at 300 yards. If you got inside 400 yards with your target in the convergence zone, you were going to kill him, period. The density of fire was such that multiple API rounds would hit the target simultaneously. Wing root, engine, fuselage, tank, all getting hit at the same time. The target just came apart. Anderson's combat record supported his confidence. Between February and November 1944, he achieved 16 aerial victories while expending an average of approximately 350 rounds per kill. His combat camera footage, preserved in the National Archives, shows German fighters being destroyed with remarkable consistency. The pattern was almost monotonous. Anderson would close to 300 to 400 yards, place his Pipper on the target's wing root or engine using his K-14 sight, fire a 2 to 3 second burst, and the target would explode or burst into flames. The Mustang's fuel capacity allowed for extended combat deep over Germany, which meant American pilots could choose their engagements more carefully. They didn't need to take hasty, low-probability shots because they were running low on fuel and needed to head home. They could wait for optimal geometry, optimal range, optimal target presentation. This patience, enabled by the Mustang's range, increased hit probability and kill probability dramatically. German pilots quickly learned to fear the Mustang, not because it was dramatically superior to the Focke-Wulf 190 or late-model Messerschmitt 109s in terms of pure performance, but because Mustang pilots could choose when and how to fight. A German pilot might successfully evade one Mustang only to find another diving on him from a different angle. The Americans had time, fuel, and ammunition to set up multiple attacks. The Germans, operating over their own territory but often low on fuel after climbing to intercept altitude, had to accept combat whether the tactical situation favored them or not. By April 1944, Luftwaffe loss rates over Germany had reached crisis levels. The Germans were losing experienced fighter pilots faster than their training system could replace them. In April alone, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 420 fighter pilots killed or missing over Germany and occupied territories. Another 180 were seriously wounded. This represented nearly 40% of the experienced fighter pilot force. The losses came disproportionately among veteran pilots. Experienced Luftwaffe fighters, confident in their abilities and accustomed to aggressive tactics, would press attacks on American bombers despite the presence of escort fighters. They expected to outfly and outfight American pilots, who often had less experience and less training. What they encountered instead was a systematic application of superior technology and doctrine that turned their experience into a liability. Veterans knew how to get close, how to press an attack through defensive fire, how to achieve the optimal firing position for their cannons. All of these skills led them to close within 400 yards of American fighters. At that range, against K-14-equipped pilots firing armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, experience stopped mattering. The German pilot might be an ace with 50 victories. The American pilot might be on his 10th combat mission. But if the American achieved a 2-second burst into the German's wing root, the German was almost certainly dead regardless of his skill level. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most respected fighter leaders, recognized the crisis with brutal clarity. In a conference with Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring in May 1944, Galland presented loss statistics that painted a devastating picture. German fighters engaging American escorts were being destroyed at a rate of 3.2 to 1. For every American fighter shot down, the Luftwaffe lost more than 3, and critically, 72% of German fighters destroyed were categorized as catastrophic loss, meaning the aircraft was completely destroyed, usually by fire or explosion, with the pilot killed or seriously wounded. Gallen's report identified American gunnery effectiveness as a primary factor. The Americans have achieved a combination of technical advantages that our pilots cannot overcome through skill alone. Their computing gun sights allow even inexperienced pilots to achieve accurate deflection shots. Their armor-piercing incendiary ammunition causes catastrophic damage to our fuel systems. Their long-range fighters allow them to choose optimal engagement conditions. We are not losing to superior individual pilot skill. We are losing to superior systematic application of technology. Göring, according to witnesses at the conference, refused to accept Gallen's assessment. The idea that American machine guns could be more effective than German cannons contradicted everything the Luftwaffe High Command believed about air combat. Göring insisted that higher loss rates resulted from pilot cowardice or inadequate training, not from any American technical advantage. He ordered increased emphasis on aggressive attack tactics, exactly the opposite of what the tactical situation required. The consequences of this denial played out in the skies over Germany through the summer of 1944. Luftwaffe pilots, under orders to press attacks aggressively, continued to close to cannon range against American fighters. They continued to die at catastrophic rates. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively lost air superiority over Germany. American bombers and fighters operated with near impunity. The invasion of Normandy proceeded without meaningful German air opposition. The transformation in .50 caliber effectiveness wasn't the only factor in achieving air superiority. American numerical superiority, the introduction of long-range escorts, improved tactics, and declining German pilot quality all contributed. But the dramatic increase in lethality of American fighter armament between mid-1943 and mid-1944 played a crucial role that has often been underappreciated in historical analysis. What seemed like a simple machine gun, firing what appeared to be simple bullets, had been transformed through careful ammunition selection, tactical doctrine, and computing gun sights into a weapons system that achieved effects comparable to cannon armament at typical combat ranges. The Luftwaffe's failure to recognize and adapt to this transformation cost them hundreds of experienced pilots during the critical first half of 1944. German pilots did eventually develop effective counter-tactics. By late 1944, surviving veterans had learned to avoid close-range combat with American fighters, to attack from beyond 400 meters and break away immediately, to never allow American fighters to achieve firing solutions on vulnerable areas. But by then, it was too late. The Luftwaffe had lost too many experienced pilots. The replacements arriving at squadrons had insufficient training and insufficient experience to implement sophisticated defensive tactics. The story of the .50 caliber incendiary round reveals a broader truth about technological warfare. Lethality comes not from individual technical specifications, but from the integration of multiple factors into an effective weapons system. The M8 armor-piercing incendiary round was not dramatically more powerful than the ammunition it replaced. Its incendiary charge contained approximately 1 gram of material. But that 1 gram, delivered to the right location on a German fighter by a pilot using a computing gun sight and following vulnerability diagrams, could cause an explosion that destroyed a 5-ton aircraft and killed a pilot who had survived years of combat. The Germans understood each individual component. They knew about incendiary ammunition. They knew about computing gun sights. They knew about vulnerability analysis. What they failed to understand was how Americans had integrated these components into a systematic approach to air combat that multiplied effectiveness beyond the sum of individual parts. By the time German intelligence pieced together the full picture, in reports compiled in late 1944 and early 1945, it no longer mattered. The Luftwaffe was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. American .50 caliber machine guns destroyed approximately 4,950 German aircraft in air-to-air combat over Europe between 1943 and 1945. The majority of these kills occurred after the introduction of widespread armor-piercing incendiary loading in late 1943. The transformation from a weapon that damaged to a weapon that destroyed had been accomplished not through dramatic technical breakthrough, but through systematic optimization of ammunition selection, tactics, and aiming technology. The young Americans who flew Thunderbolts and Mustangs over Germany rarely understood the full technical story behind their success. They knew that when they hit German fighters, those fighters tended to explode. They knew their incendiary ammunition worked. But they didn't necessarily understand the physics of fuel vapor ignition, or the vulnerability of self-sealing tanks to internal explosion, or the systematic intelligence analysis that had identified optimal aim points. They simply followed their training, used their equipment as designed, and watched German fighters fall from the sky in flames. That was enough. The technical sophistication happened at levels above them, in the work of ordnance engineers and intelligence analysts and tactical planners who transformed the 50 caliber Browning from a capable weapon into a decisive one. The Luftwaffe never knew what hit them, not because the information was hidden, but because they failed to recognize its significance until far too late. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.